Welcome, everyone. I am so excited for tonight's presentation. Much has changed over the past few months, and throughout the new normal, we have been able to continue to have our national calls each month and bring you new ideas, new policies, and ways that you can take action on climate change. Today, we're honored to hear a policy platform called Vision for Equitable Climate Action, presented by the U.S. Climate Action Network leaders, Reverend Malcom and David Arkush. We also have two ECA leaders here who have spent a great deal of time and energy participating in this process of the development of this platform. They are Steve Simon and Bob Youngie, and they will be available with the panel for Q&A at the end of the presentation. We are going to ask you all to stay muted and put your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. Also, if you hover over the bottom of the screen, you may also see a chat box where you can share ideas, put in links, and share information with other participants. We will have the Q&A at the very end. So, build up those questions and we should hopefully get to all of them. First, I'd like to introduce Reverend Michael Malcom, who is the Executive Director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and a licensed and ordained United Church of Christ minister. Reverend Malcom is the Senior Pastor of Rush Memorial Congregation, UCC in Atlanta, and he's also the founder of Martha's Corner, Inc. and the People's Justice Council, which are both 501c3 nonprofits, and the Environmental Justice Representative for the Southeast Conference of the United Church of Christ. He's currently working hard on many aspects of the U.S. Climate Action Network, and he's been involved with the Building Power from the Grassroots team, with the Climate Action Network and Climate Action Network International, and is the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Working Group for Southeast Climate and Energy Network. We also are very honored to have with us tonight David Arkush, and he's the Director of Public Citizens Climate Program. He's got broad experience advocating for the public interest in the media and all three branches of government. Recently, he co-chaired the team with the U.S. Climate Action Network, comprising 174 groups that drafted this vision for Equitable Climate Action, which is a comprehensive platform that you're going to hear about of strong, equitable climate policies. In previous roles, David was instrumental in strengthening and passing laws, including the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act of 2008 and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010. He has testified before Congress, litigated significant cases in state and federal courts, and taught administrative law and legislation, and appeared on many news channels. He's been published, quoted on publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Post, and the LA Times. He graduated with honors from Harvard Law School and Washington University in St. Louis. Right now, I would like to turn it over to Reverend Malcom, who will begin the presentation. To you, Reverend.
Thank you. Thank you to Jerry, Steve, Jen, and the entire ECA. Thank you all for having me. And thank you to David for being with me. And I hope that I can make him proud tonight. Let me grab my information real quick and we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Jen, if you will, the next slide, please. Getting myself organized here. Okay, so today's presentation, we'll give a background on VECA. We'll also look at VECA's policies, sectors, and topics. We'll do VECA policies and looking at how they cross-cut and overlay. And then we'll look at how we can get involved. And finally, we'll have questions and answers. Next slide, please. So as Jerry has said, my name is Reverend Michael Malcom, and I'm the Executive Director of the People's Justice Council in Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. I am no longer the senior pastor of Rush Memorial. I actually relocated, just like Jerry did, but I relocated to Birmingham, Alabama. And as a result, I had to let my pastor position go. I'm the international liaison for US CAN, or US Climate Action Network. But what's more is that I am a Black man who's lived his entire experience in Black communities. For saying this is because I want you to see that my endorsement of this ambitious and equitable climate vision is coming from an experiential place. Over a 2-year period, next slide, please. Over a 2-year period, there were 175 people who met and worked tirelessly on the thought that everyone deserves clean air, clean water, and a healthy food supply. The process was both grueling and tiring, but it was good because it was steeped in equity and justice. Our climate is unstable, and we need to be at 1.5. Next slide, please. Due to this instability, we are experiencing more violent storms, drought, wildfires, saltwater intrusion, and food and water insecurity. You probably asking me by now, well, who's impacted? Next slide, please. Well, the answer is everyone is impacted. Everyone feels the effect of climate change. However, everyone is not equally impacted. There are those who do the least harm that suffer the most. We are finding this to be a global issue. We are Black, we're brown, we're elderly, economically stressed, we're women, single parent households, indigenous, and disabled. We're also veterans. Next slide, please. We live in coastal areas, low elevation areas, drought-prone areas, and our ecosystems are terribly impacted by this. Next slide, please. The recent uprising of coronavirus has uncovered the effects of America's original sin. Many have had to reconcile with the intentionally misplaced term, environmental racism. Many are finding what these underserved communities have been telling people: we aren't equally protected. Environmental racism is defined as any government or industry action or failure to act that has a negative environmental impact, which disproportionately harms, whether intentional or not, individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. Redlining is a result of environmental racism. Next slide, please. Land value is based on white people's desire. Those who live in polluted communities are often the forgotten. We experience a lack of energy democracy, locally unwanted land use, the harmful effects of capitalism, such as low pay and pollution. We have no representation at decision-making tables, and there's a lack of intention and investment. Next slide, please. The VECA highlights that corporate greed, inept political leaders, disinformation, lack of focused organizing, lack of grassroots presence, and other roadblocks must be confronted and solutions must be implemented. This VECA document addresses these issues with solutions that are centered in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. Now, at this time, I'll turn it over to David, who will then give you the solutions. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Michael, for that excellent presentation. Thank you, ECA, for having us. Thank you all for joining us. So now we're on to an overview of the policies that are actually in this document. I was told you wanted to hear this, so I hope you're all up for it. It can get a little dry. I'm going to try to keep it kind of brief and light and summarize as much as I can. But it's a very dense document, really comprehensive. A couple of other pieces of background that are good to know that will help contextualize what you're about to see. So first of all, this platform was based on what the science and what equity and justice demand, not based on what people think is politically feasible. Oh, I'm sorry, next slide, please. And that was key because we were trying to get as much consensus as possible on these points. And of course, people will have lots of different judgments about what's politically feasible. But if we stay focused on the science, if we stay focused on equity and justice, we can actually get a lot more agreement across the climate movement on what needs to be done. And the other thing to keep in mind, this is part of a broad strategy to do what we think is necessary to hold warming to as low as possible. You need a policy foundation on which you can build a movement. And the climate movement has lacked one, and so we set out to make one. This is a platform on which groups can activate strong grassroots pressure for change. And our strategy is to do that, to ignite strong grassroots campaigns, and in those campaigns, center equity and justice, and center the voices of those who have been the most harmed by the climate crisis in those campaigns. And that's part of our strategy for how we're going to hold global warming, if possible, to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but as low as possible. Next slide, please. So to start with, we have a economy-wide standard, and you hear a lot of standards. A lot of times people talk about what we need to do by 2050. We felt like that wasn't very useful. What's most important is what we do soon, because we need to get going as quickly as possible. We need as much in the way of reductions as possible, as quickly as possible. And this platform calls for a 70% reduction in emissions by 2030. The way we got there was that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need 40 to 60% reduction by 2030. And we took the high end of that, and then we added a little bit to it because it's a global target. And that's a 40 to 60% cut globally. And as a matter of fairness, the US should do more. We're responsible for more of the problem. We have more resources to handle it. So we added a bit to that, and we think we should be targeting 70% by 2030. The first sector people usually talk about, and the first sector in our document, is the electric sector. There we're targeting a just and equitable transition to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. We take care to define renewable energy very carefully. There's some squirreliness in terms of what gets into various legislation to supporting renewables. The IPCC says renewable energy is energy that's replenished by natural processes at a rate that equals or exceeds its rate of use. That's like solar, geophysical sources like wind, geothermal, tidal. And we add also that renewable energy sources can't be things that are harmful to our communities. So there are a lot of things that get classified in some policies as renewable, and we're saying that we don't think those should count. So no burning wood chips, no burning wood pellets, no burning solid waste or construction or demolition debris. We also take a position on nuclear. We say that there should be no new nuclear power plants, and we should phase out existing nuclear plants as soon as we can be sure they won't be replaced by fossil fuels. And of course, we should be phasing out the subsidies as much as possible along the way as well. Next slide, please. In transportation, and this is a place where Bob Yunke from Elders Climate Action was really instrumental. He chaired this subcommittee and is really responsible for a lot of what's in this platform, which has had a lot of influence beyond this platform. It influenced the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. It influenced the Inslee campaign. Really, really great work from Bob. So in transportation, we have really ambitious targets that are sort of, are better and than what anyone else is saying, and they're vital. So by 2030, we would have a zero emission standard for new cars and trucks. We'd also have all public fleets, school buses and the like, would be zero emission. Same with all public transit. By 2035, we'd have a zero emission standard for freight vehicles. And other key, there's a lot more to the transportation policy. There's a lot more to all of these. I'm just sort of giving you some key highlights. But the last major thing in transportation is major investments in high-speed rail and public transit. In manufacturing and industrial processes, this is an area where I think people have a lot of trouble coming up with great solutions. And, the same was true to some extent of us. You see number 3 on our list is R&D. We really do need a lot of research and development to figure out better ways to do certain kinds of manufacturing and industrial processes so they'll release fewer greenhouse gases. But some things we can do include making sure that we are producing here in America more renewables and more goods that are essential to a clean economy, and at the same time doing a better job of eliminating toxics that are used in the manufacturing process. We can also do a lot with buy clean government procurement policies, right? The government is a huge buyer of many things, and it can drive a lot of change and a lot of innovation in manufacturing. Next slide. In agriculture, we want to secure the right to food. We want to make massive investments in better agricultural practices because we think that the agricultural sector should actually be a greenhouse gas sink. It shouldn't be putting off greenhouse gases. There's the potential there if we could actually adopt best practices across the field. We have a suite of policies to reduce greenhouse gas pollution from livestock. We want to promote plant-centric diets. And of course, we want to reduce food waste. On buildings and energy efficiency, we want to replace all possible appliances and equipment to be powered by electricity by 2025. We want to retrofit, do deep retrofits of all buildings. This is public, private, commercial, residential, 75% of all buildings by 2040 and 100% by 2050. These are some of the longest deadlines in the entire document, and that just reflects the reality of how much work there is to do and how long it would take to actually retrofit every existing building in the United States. To be much more efficient and that sort of thing. But in terms of new buildings, by 2025, there's no reason why new buildings can't comply with a code that makes them zero emission. Next slide, please. We have a health section, which is in part dedicated to discussing the just massive health harms from the climate crisis, and conversely, of course, the massive benefits that come with solutions. But then there was also a set of policies for reducing greenhouse gas pollution in the health sector, which is actually nearly 10% of emissions, so it's not insignificant. On phasing out fossil fuels, we have no new fossil fuel infrastructure, no bailouts for fossil fuel companies, something that the government is violating right now. A just transition for environmental justice communities and fossil fuel workers and their communities, and also much stricter bonding requirements for fossil fuel operations so that they pay more of the costs of reclamation and restoration after they're done. Next slide, please. Then we have a broad category that's drawdown, negative emissions, right? If we're going to succeed at this, we actually need to pull carbon out of the air, not just stop putting it in the air. And we emphasize natural solutions as much as possible in this area. So we want to protect, restore, enhance natural ecosystems. We want to make sure that we don't engage in false solutions, like industrial scale bioenergy with capture and storage. It's called BECCS. And we need to develop economic transition strategies for communities that are dependent on extraction because they need to change, but we need to take care of them. It's not their fault, obviously, that's how their local economy is structured and that's what their tax base is. On adaptation, we want to make sure that we develop adaptation and resilience and preparedness plans that are centered in equity. We want to halt development that makes climate vulnerable areas even more vulnerable than they already are. So I got a little visitor here. We want to use a human rights centered approach to displacement. So this is, when people actually need to leave their homes, we want to make sure that they're well taken care of, that they have food, water, shelter, medical care, that to the extent, if it's possible to return safely, that they have a right of return, that they have help, reestablishing their neighborhoods. And of course, if they're in areas that that can't be returned to, then obviously they need ample help with that kind of transition. Next slide, please. So that was, there's a bunch of policies that go by sector or by topic, and that's what I just went through. Then we have a set of policies that we call cross-cutting overlays, because they're things that apply essentially across the board to everything. So now we're going to go through a few of those. Next slide, please. So one of these things is a just transition. And when we talk about a just transition, we mean for two sets of groups. One is for environmental justice communities. Equity and justice run strongly throughout this document. We try to center them as much as possible. And we mean a lot of things by that. But one of the biggest things we mean is that the benefits of the transition to a clean economy should go first to the communities that have suffered the worst from the extractive economy. Benefits like renewable electricity generation, community-owned electric power, new infrastructure, new or retrofitted buildings, clean transportation, all of those things should go first to the communities that have been the most harmed by fossil fuel extraction. Another big principle here is ensuring that these communities have as much voice and as much control, frankly, of policymaking as is possible. There's a second set of people that we're talking about when we talk about a just transition, and those are fossil fuel workers and their communities. Because their jobs are going to go away in a lot of those communities. That means a lot of economic development needs to change, the tax base needs to change. And so in that sense, in that area, we have things like guaranteed income and benefits for 3 to 5 years for all affected workers, unionization rights, federal jobs guarantee, and ensuring good paying, family sustaining jobs. One thing, we're trying to work more and more with unions and other labor representatives. And one of the things that couldn't be clearer is, people aren't happy about a transition, obviously, in which they're going to lose their job and their community as they know it. But people really aren't happy with a job training program, right? People want a job. People want a good job, not one that is a lower wage than they've been getting, not one that they can't sustain their family on, not one that's not going to be union. So those are all rights that we want to protect in this transition. We also have a section on financing the platform, and this is mostly a real pushback on the notion that we should have to figure out how to pay for absolutely everything in a climate transition with contemporaneous revenue sources. The idea is, no, we can actually borrow money for this if we need to. We borrow money for giant wars, even ones that are terrible mistakes. We borrow money for trillions of dollars worth of tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations. We can certainly borrow some money for climate policy. We have to address the problem. It'll be more expensive not to address it than to address it. It's actually going to pay for itself many times over. It should be thought of as an investment. And we really just reject the notion that it has to be paid for with budget cuts in some other area, or has to be paid for with new taxes. Maybe some of it needs to be paid for in that way, but certainly not all. Next slide, please. We also have a section on greenhouse gas pricing, mostly gets called a carbon tax or carbon pricing. This was actually a pretty innovative piece of this platform. A lot of groups have had very significant problems with carbon pricing, mostly for environmental justice concerns. Basically, when you get into any kind of pricing or trading, you're giving an incentive for pollution to migrate to the places where it's the cheapest to pollute, and that tends to be Black and brown communities, low-income communities, but frankly, in the US, that kind of pollution tracks much more with race than income. It really is a serious problem of environmental racism. And so a lot of groups have just opposed these forms of policy outright. drawing a hard line against them. Here we did something a little bit different, which was rather than just draw a line, which sometimes gets ignored, we actually identified all of the particular problems we could come up with carbon pricing, and essentially said, sure, you can have a carbon price if you can meet all of these requirements. And there's a lot, some people have chuckled and said, maybe it's not actually possible, but so be it. If we're going to do it, we need to do it right. Some of the major points are that carbon prices can't allow the creation or perpetuation of hotspots or environmental justice harms. They get called hotspots, they get called sacrifice zones. It's grossly unjust to have racial minorities in this country who have been suffering the brunt of this pollution historically for decades, to be told that they need to continue to suffer while we fix the problem for everybody else. The carbon price also needs to be implemented in a way that's progressive, not regressive. It needs to be high enough to be effective. And somewhat counterintuitively, we think it shouldn't be a primary source of revenue for climate funding. People often talk about a carbon price as a great way to fund all sorts of other climate policies. We were kind of concerned about that. First of all, we don't want a constituency developing that really wants to keep that money, that wants those checks to continue coming. And if we do this right, we're phasing out fossil fuels so quickly that we can't really count on that revenue at all long term. So, it could be used to fund some climate policy, but we can't count on it. It definitely cannot be a primary source of the revenue. On geoengineering, this is a place we didn't get into too much of what's covered in geoengineering, but we talked about a few things. Mostly we talked about solar radiation management. This is a variety of kinds of efforts where you try to reduce the amount of heat we get from the sun. People have ideas like seeding the clouds to make them more reflective, or putting mirrors in space. We have pretty strong opposition to all of those. They're reckless and risky. They carry as much risk of harm as they do potential benefit. Another that we put in this category, although it's arguably not actually a form of geoengineering, is direct air capture. So this is different from carbon capture and storage. We're not saying we're going to capture carbon at a coal-fired power plant or at a natural gas power plant. We're saying direct air capture, direct capture of carbon from the air. And there, we said, it can be helpful on the margins. And in fact, we do need to do better than just stop creating more greenhouse gas pollution. We do need to get some out of, get a lot out of the air. But we can't count on direct air capture. There's no evidence that it could be scaled up at a level to deal with the problem. Certainly not at a reasonable cost, but probably not at all. We can't allow it to essentially incentivize the continued use of fossil fuels or perpetuate hotspots. To the extent it's used, it's not so that we can keep wantonly burning fossil fuels. And it can't be a substitute for other climate policies. It should only be used on the margins. So in the context of a really robust set of policies that are really solving this problem, like the policies in this document, then we can imagine direct air capture helping a little bit on the margins for some of the areas where it's kind of hard and takes a little bit longer to figure out how to get rid of fossil fuels. And we also make clear that we think we should put a priority on using natural solutions as much as possible for drawing down greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. I think this is our last big policy slide. So we also have a section on global issues. And one piece here actually gets to our economy-wide target, which I actually explained up front. And the reason it's here is because, again, we start with what the IPCC says is necessary, and then we adjust it for what should be our fair share globally. We also want to make sure that we provide substantial funding for other countries that are making the transition to renewable energy. We want to see $200 billion go to the Green Climate Fund. In the context of what needs to be done in climate change, that's actually not a huge amount of money. We should be able to pony up and show some responsibility for others around the world. And then there's actually quite a bit more to our international agenda, but a lot of it is this extensions of our domestic agenda. So ceasing domestic oil and gas development and exporting it, transitioning away from fossil fuels, and not supporting countries who are trying to maintain their fossil fuel infrastructure. Next slide, please. So now that you're so excited about all these policies, a few words about how to get involved. We love feedback. We imagine this is a living document. We imagine possibly approving changes to it maybe once a year. We are planning. There's a few gaps that we want to fill. We want to get feedback from local communities. We want to get feedback from anybody who hasn't been at the table and has something to say. So if you want to engage in that, feel free to get in touch. I guess probably the best way is to reach out to Bob Yunke or Steve Simon, because they've been very involved. Same thing, you could join the USCAN policy team and help with some of these efforts. You could also join Arm in Arm. This is a new grassroots mass action campaign on climate, kind of like a sunrise movement for all ages. And Arm in Arm is using this platform as the basis for its policy demands. So if you want to take action and sort of make this a real living document and help use it to fuel a real grassroots movement that's going to change this country and finally end the climate crisis, then join Arm in Arm. And there's a link on the, you can see it's arminarmforclimate.org. And I believe that is it for the presentation. So I think we're ready for question and answer.
Great. Thank you so much, David and Reverend Malcolm. And we do have some questions. So let me see where we can start. And whether it's David, Steve, or Reverend Malcolm, whichever one wants to answer these is great. First question, what are the general percentages of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the various sectors? For example, transportation, buildings, current agricultural and livestock practices, and fossil fuel extraction. Who wants to weigh in on that one?
I'll start because we've been following transportation. That right now is 35% of the national greenhouse gas emissions. And then you start adding percentages in for electric power, which would be next, probably at 30%. Greenhouse transportation is the highest. You get into manufacturing processes like cement production. I think you're looking at around 10 to 12%. I'd have to look at Hal Harvey's data. I don't have it in front of me. And then you get into emissions from farming and concentrated animal feed operations and methane production and wells and whatnot, and you get to 100 pretty quickly. So that's a rough look. If one of you have better data, please talk.
I think that is, close enough, and that's definitely the right order. It's transportation followed closely by electricity. Transportation just overtook electricity in
it just overtook it.
Followed by manufacturing, by agriculture.
I know Bob follows that very carefully.
Thank you. I think people are also surprised to know that 10% of greenhouse gas emissions are as a result of the healthcare industry. People kind of take that for granted because it doesn't appear as one of the very visible things, and it's a huge number, 10%. Next question. Has there been a discussion of how to transition the big fossil fuel companies out of that sector so that their collapse doesn't cause an economic crisis? Who wants to weigh in on that?
Well, I do know that the abandoned well problem for fracking is huge. And that can probably suck up many of the workers, and are very skilled and high paid jobs. And we have a lot of these wells are going to be abandoned. These companies are going bankrupt as we sit here now. And that is going to be one source. The other source is transition into renewable energies and also into manufacturing processes. I'm seeing estimates of hundreds of thousands of jobs just from the EV sector for automobiles. So there's work out there. It's just a matter of us being bold enough to make the change. I couldn't tell you an exact answer on those, but it's probably in the literature somewhere. I just haven't read it recently. David, do you have any data that's better?
Well, I think that's all right. The only thing I would add is that the coal companies are all failing already. Yep. And so are natural gas companies. That, in fact, gas has basically never been profitable in the last decade or so. It's like a giant bubble and super cheap prices. The major oil companies, right? The Exxons, the BPs, they're making money, but they're the only ones in fossil fuels anymore. And like Steve said, there's going to be more than enough jobs, more than enough economic development to handle that transition. We're talking about, undoing enormous amounts of what they're actively doing right now. So, right, every well that's been dug, every pipeline, decommissioning and reclaiming. Then we're talking about, right, manufacturing all new cars. We're talking about retrofitting every building in the country.
These are a lot of the same type of skills that are needed. And I see that, having worked in the industry my whole life, I see these transitions happen all the time anyways. You just don't see them. And they're going on continuously, and this will be another major shift, though.
Yeah, I agree with that, Steve and David. And I'd like to also add to that it would be irresponsible for us to continue to use our energy trying to save something that's dying. It's much more responsible for us to put our energy in something that would be profitable. And as we've seen, and as now time has shown, renewables are the more profitable sector. And so it's only responsible for us to invest in that at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Has there been any discussion of the intersection of VECA vision and policies with the COVID-19 pandemic and how we can transition out of COVID and into a clean economy?
David, I would say, and you can help to build on this, our disaster recovery plan does address that. And we are still having ongoing, as David has said, this is a living document. When we originally created this document, there was no COVID pandemic. And so we are actively addressing that in our action teams at the moment.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And we've got a little, if you go to equitableclimateaction.org, that's the website where this this platform lives. You scroll down a little bit, there is sort of a special statement on COVID that we put out around, because we basically issued this, released this while the COVID pandemic was already going on. And one of the pieces in there, we talk about how so many of the policies in here are perfect fits for economic recovery. And some of them can begin even in a time of social distancing, or at least we think they probably can. And there's really a perfect fit between climate solutions and economic recovery. Again, because of all the jobs that are going to be created, all the economic development that needs to happen, like we just discussed.
And the benefits could be huge, as Bob likes to point out. Look at what the skies were like in LA and Chicago, in Atlanta, in Detroit during the peak of this, which is, I guess, still going on, when people weren't driving around as much. And that can be a glimpse of the future we could get by phasing some of these, at least in terms of air quality.
Thank you. Are there things that ECA members can do in their states and local governments to begin to move this vision forward into really enacting policy at a state and local level?
I'm going to say yes, and then I'm going to pass it back to Jerry or Steve to tell you how you can actually get involved on the ECA level, because I don't think that's something that David or I should actually answer.
I think one thing that we can do is continue to provide information about the status and information, easy information to pass on. And I know there are some fact sheets out there that we could make available to people so that they've got good current information and can go to their local governments. We also have currently a campaign getting governments to declare a climate emergency. And I think maybe this could be integrated together with that campaign.
Absolutely. Our Council of Chapters, which is a meeting of all our chapters, and we have about 10 of them now, and big ones in Massachusetts and California, a big one in Arizona. But all of them are active at a local level, and they'll take policies such as clean air and no coal and phasing out this and really work. Even in Indiana, where I live, there's a huge shut down the coal power plant motion in progress. And so, you may have to start small, but there's things everywhere. I mean, it's a target-rich environment from my DOD days. Okay.
I will give you a more practical step that is actually achievable for everybody that's listening to me right now. I'll tell you the same thing that Dr. Catherine Hayhoe told me. Talk to somebody.
Yeah.
Talk to somebody. Start letting people know that this document actually exists, and let them know what it's about. Get people excited about it. At the end of the day, this is about planet and people.
We will be introducing a new campaign for letter writing and sending letters based on VECA sectors, and that's going to start up real soon. So that's in the works right now. So that's going to coalesce with the election and many things that need to happen after the election. Of course, we're all keeping our fingers crossed on that one.
That's fantastic. Yeah, people can get involved in Arm in Arm. And again, one of the purposes of making this document was to give people who wanted it guidance on, a lot of these policies are federal, but a lot of them are actually things that need to be done at the state or local level, or can be. And so part of it is, pick out pieces of it and start advocating locally. And actually we just had the US Can Annual Conference and sort of re-upped on this work. And one of the things that got a lot of interest was, when we update this, doing more to give guidance to people engaged in local policy. So doing a little bit more to flesh out what can be done locally.
Thank you. Here's another one. In parallel with carbon reduction, why no geoengineering? Is it essential to flatten the temperature curve to avoid tipping points, a few of which have already been passed?
I kind of worked on that section a little bit. I'll be glad. We have a couple experts in Indiana down at Indiana University, and I'm trying to remember the professor's name because I sat in a short course on this very subject. And he said, I am the last person you want to talk to. He said, if we do this, we are taking risk. And he modeled them. He's done intense models with the experts out of MIT and Harvard, and has projected what it can do potentially, but what the risks are huge. And there's winners and losers. And he said it, and by the way, if you don't do all the other actions, as soon as you stop doing this, you're going back worse to where you were. And that has been confirmed scientifically. So I think geoengineering itself, there is some tests going on right now. They're looking at some sea issues, and we'll see how they come out. But he was talking more about atmospheric intervention with particles like sulfur and whatnot. There's direct air capture, on the other hand, is definitely probably going to be needed to avoid overshoot. We're not going to get quite to our temperature, and we're going to need to work hard. but it's an extremely expensive venture. So I don't, all the estimates I've seen have been enormous on what it would cost to even bring down the atmospheric CO2 by a couple parts per million. I mean, you're talking trillions. So we'll see. It's very soon, very early in that technology. It may get better, but if you sit down with a climate modeler, he's not going to give you too much to go. And I sat down with Michael more on this, and Michael Mann, and he said, I don't like it, is what he told me.
Thanks, Steve. So what are the USCAN member plans for moving VECA forward into an actual implementation? So now we have the document. How does USCAN, what's the strategy for taking it out of USCAN and forward?
I would say there's a couple of key pieces. One is we are injecting it into all sorts of other climate plans and policies. So one of the other questions I saw here was, what's the relationship between this and the Green New Deal, or how does it fit together? There isn't a Green New Deal, right? There isn't a fully written out platform. There's sort of like an outline. If there were one, it would look a lot like this. The Sunrise Movement was involved in this. They're very supportive of it. At one point early on, there was discussion of actually just saying that we were writing the Green New Deal, and we decided not to because we weren't sure that that label was necessarily going to be the right way to go. But there's a group called the Green New Deal Network that is advocating for, it's a bunch of groups working together to create the political space to pass a Green New Deal. And we sit at that table, USCAN does, so we're contributing there. And then there's a bunch of other policy tables that we're sitting, we're trying to get the biggest green groups in the country to take more of these ideas. Some, they're also part of USCAN, most of them, and some of them they contribute a lot to this. And some of them agree with basically all of it, and some of them have some big differences with it. But we're pushing it on those fronts. But then, so beyond the sort of getting other nonprofits, climate groups to adopt it, there's actually advocacy to members of Congress, to presidential campaigns. So before we even released this, drafts of it were leaked to presidential campaigns and were really influential on some of them, including Governor Inslee's campaign and Elizabeth Warren's campaign. And we shared a draft with the House Select Committee on the climate crisis. It's very clearly had an impact on them. There's a few sections where it's almost like they just really took seriously what we were saying. And so there's a lot more Hill advocacy to be done. And then again, the third thing is people pushing it in their own organizations, in their own local communities. And again, we're hopeful. Arm in Arm has basically just launched. But the goal is they're going to be building a mass movement that everybody in this country is going to have heard of pretty soon. And this is the basis of their policy demands.
Thank you. Thank you. So here's another question. Shouldn't we be concerned with the greenhouse gas pricing that delivers shock to the economy? For example, a sudden steep increase in gasoline prices, which doesn't allow consumers time to make changes to use less, but simply makes necessary driving, excuse me, much more expensive. Without it being a phased-in approach, greenhouse gas pricing would encounter real political opposition.
I can answer that one. I completely agree. And I've been telling people that. I think it would be disastrous to have a sudden high greenhouse gas price that drives up gas prices at the pump, or and I do believe it would backfire politically, and that we need to be a lot smarter about if that kind of a policy is ever going to be implemented. In general, I'm a very, very strong proponent of what they call supply side fossil fuel policy. So cutting off the supply, it's really important, right? We've got way too many known reserves of fossil fuels. We can't burn them all, or we're going to be in big trouble. But we do have to be very careful how we implement those policies. We can't have a huge shock to the system that's going to immediately drive up prices, spike the economy, and have a backlash.
So David, I'd like to step in as well on that and speak from an equity standpoint. And let's look at who will be hurt by something like that, realistically. So you put a luxury tax, so to speak, on the gas prices, which wouldn't be a problem for the haves. But our essential workers, who we've labeled as essential, but we don't pay as essential, are the ones that'll be harmed by this. So I think that when we make those type of decisions, we have to keep everybody in mind. We don't have the luxury of making those decisions without, with leaving community out of it.
You know, a lot of us in ECA came out of Citizen Climate Lobby, or we do both. And, you know, we have a member, CCL is in US CAN, and we had a very active member from their leadership. And he actually had no problem with our constraints, because if you look at their HR 763, which is their bill in Congress, everybody knows it's no silver bullet, but at least the dividend is emphasized back to people of low income. And so we'll see if that ever gets implemented. It does have some support. CCL's been working extremely hard for 10 years on this, and maybe they'll get some momentum. Now, I will say that the other version from Ted, what's his name, and company that went into the Republican area is very stricter, and I don't think is as equitable at all, and it does not meet our criteria. While the CCL's is pretty close. I think I asked Jamie about it, and he said it was pretty close.
Thank you. We have a ton of questions here. I know we're not going to be able to get through them all, and I thank you all for your patience in being able to answer them. Here's a comment and a thank you. Thank you both for all this good information. The goals are clear, but so far, no plan or plans to implement the goals. How to ensure transition to 100% clean. And I would add to that, how do you ensure a transition to 100% clean and it be equitable and just? How to be sure low-income communities are not harmfully or disproportionately affected, and how do you go about securing the right to food? This is a big, huge question. But basically, what will US CAN do to make these things happen? Or will they not really take an active role in ensuring that the policies are implemented? Who wants to take a stab at this one?
I'll let David go, because I don't even think I have authority to speak and speak on that.
I would just say some of this we've addressed already. I think there are pieces of this are actually details that still do need to be worked out, but I'm confident that can be. We've been talking about this recently. How do you? Some of the language we've been using recently is to express the 100% clean goal and include with it what we would call an equity screen, right? So include in the policymaking process that there is, whether it's an input from the public or stakeholder consultation, the kind of thing that happens when regulatory agencies write rules all the time, or if it's actually like a council of advisors from frontline communities that are engaged in making the policies in the first place. Point is, right there along with the development of the policy, you want to be ensuring that there's an equity screen to make sure it's done in the right way. I mean, that answers that piece of it. In terms of ensuring that low-income communities, communities of color aren't harmed or disproportionately affected. Yeah, it was a big question. I think there's a lot of detail work that does need to be done.
Yeah. And you're right, it's a process and it's an evolution, and it's not going to happen overnight. We know that we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us. from everyone and everywhere to be able to ensure that these policies are actually implemented, and ensure that, have an eye on them always through the lens of equity and justice. And if it doesn't meet muster there, then it's not going to be right. Next question. We're almost done with time. I've heard some sources that the military is one of the biggest or the biggest entity in causing climate change and contributing to climate change. What do you say about that?
Having worked with DOD on some of this and been to many of their bases and realized the challenges they have, they are probably being as aggressive as anybody in terms of trying to get their act together, and they know they've got an extreme uphill fight. Their naval bases are all at risk. The one in Newport News is at extreme risk. The one up in Bremerton, Washington State is at risk. These are major submarine bases and military and naval bases. The need to do energy efficiency is everywhere in the military, and they know it, and it's sucking up more of their budget. And we're going to see some adjustments need to be made in terms of the size. There's a big movement now, of course, to reduce the size of the budget to the military, and maybe more of it will need to go into climate mitigation, into taking steps to reduce their energy needs. But it's huge, obviously.
We have time for one last question, and it's a good way to close. You've all done a great deal and put a lot of time and energy and passion into developing VECA and other actions. What gives each of you most hope that we can in fact avoid a future environmental crisis beyond where we are today? So, David, what gives you hope?
I was hoping I'd go last. It gives me hope. Well, certainly the people who are involved in things like this, people like Michael, people like Steve. I'm really hopeful about the youth climate movements, and I'm really hopeful about the movement for Black Lives. I just think that we have changes afoot right now, right? These are very hard things to change, but we're in a moment now where more people are getting engaged and more people are listening, and that's hopeful.
That is hopeful. Reverend Malcolm, what gives you hope?
The lack of choice.
Yeah.
At this point, I don't think we have a choice but to get this together or we won't survive. And I think that it's coming to a point where everybody's seeing that. The other thing that gives me hope, one of the things that I do is I'm the co-chair for the Faith Working Group for the Climate Strikes and the Youth Climate Strikes. And I have to be honest with you, those young people give me not just hope, but energy. I'm telling you.
Yep.
What I see from them is that they looked into our future and have decided we don't want that, and have thrown it back at us and decided that we will forge a new future that is more equitable and just. And let me tell you, they got a preacher behind them. I'm 100% behind them on this. And that gives me, again, not only hope, but it gives me energy.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. Steve, what gives you hope here?
They said it. I see the youth movement, and as you know, ECA is very engaged with the youth. They are our future. They're the reason we exist as a movement. Our deal is our kids and grandkids, and they're the ones that are going to make the change. Mm-hmm. We need to be there for them and help get things done and get off our duffs and stop sitting around in our book clubs thing, which is fine, of course. I love my book clubs, but there's more to do, and we have to get out and bang on the doors. And the Black Lives Matter, the whole, to me, I haven't been more hopeful about change in my probably in 50 years since I was a kid, doing protests against Vietnam and racial injustice back in the 60s. So I see a lot of hope. This is the best set of generations I've seen in my lifetime.
I agree, and you're right. The youth are our only hope. And I heard a youth leader comment the other day about saying, well, we keep hearing that we are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, and we're not. We're the leaders of today because nobody else is leading. We are the leaders. It's not the leaders of tomorrow. And it's just really struck home because it's true. They stepped up and we will support, but it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of energy on our part. I would like to thank you all very much. I'd like to thank all the participants for being on the call. I hope you've enjoyed it. You will get a copy of the recording in a couple of days, and hopefully the PowerPoint also. I think we covered most of the questions, and then there were some redundancies left that we'd already discussed as we went along. So Reverend Malcom, David Arkush, and Steve Simon, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your passion, and we'll see you again. Thanks a lot, and good night, everybody.